Good afternoon, everyone. The three of us are close friends who all lived different experiences in the 1960s. I've known Doris for 51 years, and the love of my life, Oatsie, worked with the love of Doris's life, Dick Goodwin, during the triumphs and tragedies of the 1960s. I should add that I was inspired to spend my own life in politics because of President Kennedy, and in truth, at least partly because of the speeches Dick Goodwin wrote for him. Doris, in your new book, An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 1960s, which is actually, in my view, a unique take on that period, you describe a very young Dick Goodwin in the 60 JFK campaign, and then helping to shape the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps, and even exchanging respectful words at an international conference with Che Guevara, who brought Dick a box of Cuban cigars. Dick kept everything. How did he look back on that period?
Yeah, I think that Dick never lost the romanticism that he felt about the 1960s. I mean, here he was only in his late 20s when he started working on the JFK campaign as the second speechwriter under Sorensen. He had just finished Harvard Law School, clerking for Justice Frankfurter, and investigating the quiz show scandal. Some of you may have remembered those $64,000 questions at 21. That was Dick who found out that they were being corrupt. So anyway, he was on the plane with Kennedy, and it was so much smaller than campaigns. They're huge bureaucracies now. The government is a huge bureaucracy now. He was on a plane that Joe Kennedy had leased to his son, and there's a small team there. They have beds. The beds that Ted and Dick have can become, the chairs they have become beds. Kennedy has his own little suite in the back. And so there's an intimacy that campaign that he will never forget. And that's when, during that campaign, he did indeed, was at the beginning of the Peace Corps at the University of Michigan. He was at the debate. And the great story he tells about the debate is he was so excited as a young person. After the Nixon-Kennedy first debate, he came back to the plane. John Kennedy was relaxing with a tomato soup and a beer. That was his way of relaxing. and they're analyzing, Sorensen and JFK are analyzing the debate. What could we have done better? And Dick, like a young kid, says, "What are you doing? We won the debate. We've won the election. It's all great. We should be celebrating." And the veteran, Jack Kennedy, looks at him and says, "Next week, Cold War. Next week, foreign policy. We better get some sleep." But that shows that kind of youngish spirit that he had. The other thing that I think showed it so much is that right during the parade at the inauguration, he was waiting. It was so cold during the inauguration, as some of you may remember, and John Kennedy wasn't wearing a top coat, so neither could anybody else. And so he was freezing. He couldn't wait till it was over, and endless things coming through the parade. Finally, he decides, as soon as it's over, I'm going to go in the West Wing and examine my office. And he's so excited to see it. And who else is in the West Wing examining the office than JFK? So he's looking at the Oval Office. He's looking at his office in the West Wing. And JFK says to him, "Did you see the Coast Guard contingent?" And Dick cannot remember one contingent from the other. And JFK says to him, "There wasn't a black face among them. I want you to do something about it." So this is his first mission. The first mission as a little kid he gets to, not a little kid, a young kid he gets to do. So he runs upstairs to his office. He doesn't even know where the Coast Guard is. It's in the Treasury Department, it turns out. So he calls the Treasury Secretary. He tells him we have to do something about integrating the Coast Guard. And they do. They integrate that. They do a lot of other integration of government agencies. And he says that, oh my God, with a telephone you can change the world. So that was a great feeling to start it all. And then he's tasked during the campaign of writing a speech about Latin America. And because there's not anybody else writing, he'd only had one course in Berlitz Spanish. He knew nothing about Latin America, but he writes a good speech, and he calls for a $1 billion program to help Latin American people with land distribution and social distribution instead of helping the dictators, and it becomes the Alliance for Progress. So this kid then is involved in the task force of an Alliance for Progress. He sort of screws it up by meeting Che Guevara, and then he's considered a right wing, goes against him for having been conducting foreign policy as a 30-year-old kid, but nonetheless, he looks back on that whole period like you do, when you were even younger, obviously, but there's something about John Kennedy, there was something about that era, there was something about that time, that maybe it's been over-romanticized as Camelot, but it was a very inspiring time.
Okay, let's talk some more about that time, because both of you were at the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. How did it feel that day, Oatsie and then Doris?
I was working as a NASA intern because you filled out a form if you were in college. I didn't know anything except that spaceships went up. But I was there.
That was good to know.
It was good. It was a beginning. It was a beginning. I was there, and then a group of us went to the March on Washington. And it was extraordinary, really extraordinary. The most significant thing for me was there was an older gentleman, maybe he was in his 40s, and he had on overalls, like engineer overalls. I didn't know that that meant he was a member of Corps. That's what the Corps people wore all the time. And when we were singing, he reached out and I took his hand, and his hand felt like a piece of wood. He had worked so hard outside his whole life that's what there was. I think being there changed my life. I dropped out of school. Several months later, I went to work for United Press International. That was the country's second AP, UPI. And in 1964, within a month, I covered the Philadelphia riots, the Democratic Convention, and Miss America. I could do it all.
Doris?
Yeah, I think for me it changed my life as well. I mean, what's important to remember about the march is that the government and JFK's administration was very nervous about it because they had a civil rights bill that he'd introduced, and they were afraid if any violence took place, and they assumed with 250,000 people coming, as it turned out, there might be violence. So all the bars were closed. Hospitals could only do actual surgery, no selective surgery. The baseball game was postponed, and we were told as State Department interns we weren't supposed to go. In fact, the government people were not supposed to go. We were given the day off not to be able to go, but to not be out on the streets because of the violence. But of course we went. You know, you're 20 years old, you're going to go. And for me, it was, I'd never been a part of something where I felt larger than myself. And when you went, there was all the question of how many blacks would be there, how many whites. By the end of it, you didn't think those terms anymore. We were all together. And I carried a sign, Protestants and Jews and Catholics unite for civil rights. And then we too, at the moment when we were singing We Shall Overcome, when people reached out and held hands, and I just felt this extraordinary sense of being lifted up to something I had never been before. I went back to college. I'm not as brave as you by jumping out and trying to do something that mattered. I went back to college, but I changed. I was going to be I'd studied Russian and French, and I was going to get a Fulbright to go to Paris, and I turned it all down. I wanted to be in America, where the civil rights movement was happening. So thank God that march happened.
Yeah. So with LBJ in the White House, Dick Goodwin plays a historic role. He coined the term Great Society. He wrote that speech. He wrote the landmark We Shall Overcome voting rights address to Congress, and actually didn't let people see the manuscript, including the president, until just before he went up to Capitol Hill. So he had what had to be an incredibly fulfilling role, and Johnson treasured him. What led to his disillusionment with Johnson and his decision to leave the administration?
Yeah, I think in so many ways, despite the romanticism with the Kennedy administration, no question what he did with LBJ was the most important part of his public legacy. I mean, especially that We Shall Overcome speech. I mean, that's a time when words mattered. Words really mattered. And they only had a day to write that speech. And he put his watch in the drawer so that he couldn't see time passing. And he did have to turn pages out little by little by little to LBJ, but he didn't want anyone else screwing up with it. So that's why he wanted to do it. But it has that great phrase. He took 2 hours in the morning to figure out what should be the opening sentence. Any of us who write know that's the hardest thing, the first chapter, the first line of a column. And it came out, tonight I speak for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I couldn't write that if I had 20 hours to write it. Anyway, at the end of that speech, when he was in the joint session of Congress, listening to Johnson having talked about voting rights and how important it was, he said never could he have imagined that night that 2 years later he'd be marching against him on the streets. Or never could I have imagined, as I was listening to it as a college student, never could I have imagined that I would be working for him a couple years later. But what happened, of course, was not simply the war in Vietnam. In 1965, he just decided he'd always wanted to be a writer. He'd gotten a fellowship at Wesleyan, so he was going to go there and begin to write, and he was exhausted. Working with Johnson was incredibly fulfilling, but exhausted. You couldn't have a moment of your own life. But then once he was out, in Wesleyan. He started turning against the war. He gave the first administration official to speak out against the war. Somebody asked Johnson, what do you feel about that? And he said, it's like a dog biting its own owner. And the two of them then really had a tough break and hurt, and they never really spoke again. So it was very sad for me for such a long period of time because such greatness had happened. And luckily, when we went through the boxes, he was able to feel all these 300 boxes that he kept.
Tell them about the boxes, because it's amazing.
Well, he just schlepped along 300 boxes with us our whole married life from one house to another. And, people say you get baggage when you marry somebody. And I looked in them. I knew they had great stuff in them, but he didn't want to look through them because the decade had ended so sadly. Bobby was his great friend, and we'll talk about that. But anyway, when we went through the boxes, it just made him remember, thank God, what it was that was in the Great Society, in those years of civil rights and voting rights. And some of that anger that he felt the rest of his life against Lyndon Johnson was softened. I remember one night after we were going through the We Shall Overcome box, and then when we went upstairs, he said, oh my God, I'm feeling affection for the old guy again. And I was saying, yay, that's what I wanted you to feel all along.
So, Oatsie, Dick had not yet enlisted in the Eugene McCarthy campaign, challenging LBJ for renomination when you went to work there. Tell us about how you initially got hired, what happened, and how did Dick react later when you told him the story?
I got hired by Seymour Hersh, who was the press secretary. None of us had ever done a campaign. None of us. Nobody. Nada. And he said to me, you're going to be Mrs. McCarthy's press secretary, Abigail McCarthy. And I said, fine. And I go the first day, after I've been hired, to this huge empty office where there's nothing. They haven't brought the desk in, they're not typewriters, whatever. It was pretty primitive. And the group there included Ann Wexler, who later became a real powerhouse in the Carter administration, Sandy Frusher, Curtis Gans. There were 6 or 7 people. And Mrs. McCarthy, who allegedly was an intellectual from Minnesota, now she meets me, I'm the press secretary, and she says to me, Marylouise, we certainly have a lot of Hebrews in this campaign. So I went over to Hersh, I said, I quit. This is not, he said, don't worry. He said, I'm going to be the press secretary. You can be the assistant national press secretary. Much better job. I said, okay. And we struggle through. We go up to New Hampshire. We have all these kid volunteers. Hersh calls them teenies. I mean, it's pretty scotch tapey, And then Dick comes. I mean, the big guy is there. We got Dick Goodwin. We must be going to win. So I made him a big sign over his desk. Hersh called all the helpers who were all from Ivy League schools. He called them the teenies. I made Dick a sign that said, the Che Guevara of the teeny box.
Is that great?
He loved it. And there was no question that what he did was he empowered the campaign. Now, I'll tell you how. Doris has one mistake in her book. I've read it twice. She says that be clean for Jean meant people got their hair cut. It meant no dope. I know.
I honestly thought that's what, get your beards cut, your hair cut.
I'm going to tell you why. I'll tell you why you thought
Whoa.
it. So we had a big sign, be clean for Jean. So a reporter from the New York Daily News, Danny Farrell, who I knew because I'd been a reporter in New York, came up to me and said, this is not about getting your hair cut. This is about drugs. Oh, I said, no, Danny, no. And in fact, we're having people getting their hair cut today. I said, Jimmy Hart, the 16-year-old son of Senator Phil Hart, will be getting his hair cut in about an hour. I said, oh, yeah. So I went and found Jimmy. I said, you're getting your hair cut in an hour.
So that's how it began?
The New York Daily News put photos in. Jimmy Hart getting his hair cut, and then there we were, be clean for Jean.
I love it. This is great.
Doris.
It was great. It was really great. Now, McCarthy allegedly won, right? But he didn't win.
Well, let's talk about that in a minute. How did Dick feel, if you don't mind?
I feel fine, having a good time.
I have to ask my wife's permission. How did Dick feel? He had so many memos, memories. How did he feel about those early days in the McCarthy
He
campaign?
loved it. I mean, what had happened is after he broke with Johnson, he wanted Bobby Kennedy, who had become his great friend, to run for the presidency, but Bobby kept resisting and finally said no. And so he just decided, he said to Bobby, when Bobby finally said no, I'm just going up to New Hampshire and I'm going to work for McCarthy. So he goes up and he finds Cy Hirsch, and he knew he was the press secretary. And he said, here I am, Cy, you and me and this typewriter, we're going to bring down the president of the United States. There was no modesty in him at that time.
Right.
But when he recalled, when we went through the boxes that had to do with 68, I think it was the happiest campaign he'd ever been in. He loved Mary Lou. I mean, he said when he first found out, he said when he went with McCarthy the first couple of days, it was kind of scary because there weren't a lot of people there. He was talking sort of as a professor, and it didn't have a zest to it. And he got to the place where the kids were, and first voice he hears is Mary. She has a loud voice. Hello, Dick's here. And he said that what happened is the kids loved him. He loved the kids. He said he felt like the ancient mariner, that he would be telling them stories about the White House, and they'd sit up all night, and they'd want more and more. He felt that it was the most remarkable field organization he ever saw before or after the presidency. Those kids were so committed. They learned how to go. What did they do? They were taught to go to the houses. You know this better, I'm sure, than I, just Dick telling me. And they just were supposed to listen. The state of New Hampshire was a hawkish state, so this is not easy, you know. And they already had the people who were against the war, and so they were not supposed to be talking about the war. They were supposed to be talking about, what are you feeling? What do you care about? Don't you think the country's in chaos? Don't you think we need leadership? And then they'd say to them, you know, well, here we are. We're old and young. We're talking. This is what can happen in the country if McCarthy wins. He loved it, and he loved you so much.
Oh, and I loved him. I tell you, it was
Isn't this amazing?
magical.
We didn't know each other then.
We didn't know each other. It was magical. Now, McCarthy supposedly won New Hampshire.
That's I was going to ask you to.
Okay.
Quote unquote won. Tell us how that happened.
A guy named Paul Week, who was a recalcitrant reporter. He worked for the Albuquerque Journal, and he was kind of dissed in Washington. But occasionally, he wrote for New Republic, which was a significant liberal publication. And he was up in New Hampshire, and he got the governor of New Hampshire, who was in charge of the Johnson campaign, to say that if McCarthy got anywhere over 40%, it was a victory. McCarthy got 42%. So I got to stand up and announce that McCarthy was had won the other thing. What was amazing was that my mother finally realized that I had not gone off to join the communists.
And I actually have a tape from NBC of Marylouise of Oatsie announcing this victory. We've won this giant victory here. We're going to stop the war. But then you move on to Wisconsin, where you and Cy Hirsch quit. Why, and what did Dick do when you quit?
So McCarthy would not have a civil rights statement. This is 1968. The whole country is involved one way or another in civil rights. He won't allow us to put out a one-page statement. And Hirsch goes in. Dick went in, still wouldn't do it. So when we get to Milwaukee, Hirsch and I sneak our way into a field organization meeting where the guy who's running the field is announcing that there are 350,000 Polish Americans in the Milwaukee area, so we aren't going to have any statement on civil rights. So I said, I gotten good at this. I said, I quit. Hirsch said, let's not quit yet. Let's go up to Stevens Point, where the candidate is tomorrow, and just see how he does. So we go up there, and he was good. It was like he had taken a Liven Up pill. He was targeted. He was targeted. He was charming. Still didn't say civil rights. But as he came off the stage, there was an African-American couple, well-dressed with McCarthy buttons on, and maybe their 10-year-old son, sports jacket. Everybody had dressed up to meet McCarthy. And Hirsch says, oh, look, this is good. He's talking to them. He's being very social. And as he's getting back in the car after saying goodbye, he pats the kid on the head. And as he gets in the car, he wipes his hand on his pants. So I said to Hirsch, I'm out of here. Hirsch said, me too. So we race back. We got to go tell Dick he's back in Milwaukee. And he was in his suite. There were these two guys I called the Gold Dust twins, which he loved. Arnold Hyatt, who owned Stride Right Shoes, and Howard Stein, who was the chair of Dreyfus. And so I told Dick what happened. Hirsch wouldn't even talk to me. He was so upset that this whole thing had happened. And Dick turned to Howard Stein. He said, "Howard, how much money do you have in your wallet?" No, take it out, take it out. And Howard Stein had $700. I didn't know people had $700 in a wallet. And he said, "Give it to the kid, she's out of a job." In the middle of everything, he thought about me not having money to get through the next 2 weeks. That's Dick Goodwin. Okay,
Wow.
that's what I say too. Yay, Dick.
And so what happened to Dick was that he had promised McCarthy that he'd go through Wisconsin, but then he had told them that if Bobby gets in the race, then he's my best friend, and I'm going to have to leave. And McCarthy understood that. So Bobby kept calling, Teddy, Jackie, they kept calling. Cy had the same bedroom as Dick.
Yes.
And Cy said later that he would hear from the Kennedys trying to reach Goodwin to get out of the campaign. And he said after a while they knew him well enough. They called him, "Hey, Cy, where's your roommate?" But at any rate, so he felt he had to stay till the end of Wisconsin. But then he left to go with Bobby Kennedy. But he would always remember, and Bobby Kennedy's campaign was larger, more structured. A lot of the people who had not wanted him to run were now running the thing. And he comes in late, and they're saying, "You're late getting in there." He said, "I was the one who said he should have run in the first place." But it turned out he ended up doing movies for Bobby and film just to get in L.A. with Frankenheimer to get away from the internal dynamics. But he looked back on that time really as the night that McCarthy won. It was just incredible. And then he was up in New Hampshire when LBJ withdrew from the race, and he watched the New Hampshire, from New Hampshire, the March 31st speech with Teddy White. And he danced around and was so happy, and then I got mad at him for not feeling empathetic toward LBJ.
There seemed, I'm going to get to that in a second, but there seemed to be an almost visceral relationship between Dick and the real Robert Kennedy. Can you describe that?
It really was a curious relationship. I mean, he hadn't known him too well when he was in the White House. And then he got friendly with Jackie during those years in the White House. And Jackie and Bobby were, of course, friendly. And the whole relationship began on a peculiar skating story. I remember, you may remember reading it. Dick was having champagne with Jackie and drinking with her in her apartment. Bobby came in and said, "Don't you remember we're supposed to go skating, ice skating?" Dick, of course, had never been ice skating, but he said, "You can come along if you want to." They go, and the two of them are ice skating beautifully. Dick has to put rented skates on. He's falling. He's holding onto the thing. He hates the whole thing. Finally, they say, "Well, let's go to get a drink." And they go to the plaza. And then Bobby's got new knowledge. He's been learning a lot. He says, "I've learned that things can move faster than the speed of light." And Dick said, "I finally got him now." He said, "No, they can't." They call up the head of the science program, find out that he was right. They'd bet a case of champagne. But as Bobby said, as Dick said, "I never got the champagne, but he became my best friend." 3 weeks later, he invited him to a South America trip. He liked that kind of camaraderie, collaboration, and fighting. And then they became, I think you're right, it was visceral. It was a chemical reaction. They felt they were best friends. They were kind of awkward together. They loved literature at that time. They loved poetry. They loved politics. And it was Dick's best friend in public life. So when he didn't run for the race, he was heartbroken. And then he joined the campaign. And they felt he was with him in California. He was with him on that last day of his life. He was at Frankenheimer's house in Malibu, and they were planning the talk for that night, planning everything that was going to come later. He was with him when he gave the last speech that he gave. He was with him when he died, and it was devastating to him. It was more than anything that had happened before, because they had plans for what he thought he would have been a great president, much better than McCarthy. I mean, he liked McCarthy's capacity, but McCarthy on civil rights, McCarthy on anything beyond this issue. And also in the book that I wrote, I shouldn't have said it, it was a little overdone, but Abigail said at one point that when Dick came in, it was great to have a veteran, but he was very ugly. So I consigned her to a state of hell for having said he was ugly. He was great looking.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Lyndon Johnson, because at this point, you are a White House fellow. You're assigned to work with him, not initially. Initially, you're going to work with the Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz, but he wants you in the White House. And yet you had written a piece critical of Johnson just before all of you took that job.
Yeah, I, just like so many young people, was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement before I got the fellowship to go to work in Washington. And a friend of mine and I wrote a piece against LBJ, for the New Republic, against the war. And we weren't sure it would get published, but 2 days after the dance, it suddenly appears with the title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. So I was sure he'd kick me out, but instead he said, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So that's how that all began. So I felt very empathetic when Johnson withdrew from that race. And I really think it was not simply because he was going to lose in Wisconsin and he had lost because of you in New Hampshire, but because he really knew that the war had to be sort of wound down. Tet Offensive had happened, and they told him you'd have to put 200,000 more troops in there, so he decided, I'm going to start with a bombing halt, and then he stunned the nation by saying he was going to pull out of the race. And for a few days, it was the happiest time of his presidency because all of a sudden, his public opinion polls went from 57% against him to 57% for him. Everybody said he'd done it for the country. And then North Vietnam sent a note in on April 3rd that they would come to the bargaining table. And he had filled a whole plane of people ready to go to Hawaii to start the beginnings of the talks. And they were going to leave on the night of April 4th. On April 4th, Martin Luther King was killed. The riots happened. They never got on track again. And he goes to the convention still supporting the war. So it was really sad, one of those moments that might have changed the course of history.
Oatsie, in this period and before Robert Kennedy's assassinated, you were unemployed. And Dick suddenly had a job for you. What was it?
He called me on the phone and he said, I have a job for you. I was thrilled. He said, I want you to go up to Long Island and run Al Lowenstein's congressional campaign. Well, Lowenstein was the guy who had started Dump Johnson the fall before. He was a big activist, big friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and he had decided to run. He was an interloper. He'd come out and kind of rented a house in Long Beach, and he was going to run for that congressional district, the 5.
It was my district, actually.
Is that right? Wow. So I said, Dick, I don't think I've ever voted in a congressional campaign. I don't think I can run it. What should I do? He said, get the checkbook.
He knew the importance.
Get the checkbook. So I get in a car with a friend who was going to drive up with me. We drive up to Long Island, and I get the checkbook. Now, here's a problem. There's no money in the account. Zippity-doo. So there's a wonderful woman named Sarah Kovner who is in New York and still active raising money for Democrats. She's 88. She's extraordinary.
Wow.
She was running the money side and the field side of the Paul O'Dwyer campaign.
Oh,
He
yeah, I
was
remember.
running for
Senate,
Senate.
yeah.
So I had to go in humbly every couple days and see her and say, oh, Sarah, I have no money. I can't do this. I can't print a thing, but da-da-da-da-da. Okay. I'm sitting the night of the Bobby Kennedy victory in California with a guy named Steve Cohen, a good friend of mine, big researcher for McCarthy, and Robert Vaughn, the man from Uncle, was one of the speakers we had for McCarthy. He was there too, but he went to bed. He said, I've seen it, I'm going to bed. And we're waiting for Bobby to call Al to tell him what day he's going to come campaign for him. And as we watch, he's killed. It's over. I mean, it was so much sorrow to carry in just a few months, besides which every day the war got worse and worse. More Americans dying, more Vietnamese dying, more no end to any of this. So Al gets up the next morning and he said, we just have to win this race. And we did. We won the primary race, and he was going to run for Congress in the 5th. So the night that we won the race, Cohen and I went into New York and met with Sarah and had a glass of champagne and came back out, I don't know, at 6 in the morning, and Al said, take me to the airport. So Cohen drove Al and me to the airport. I was exhausted. And we got on a plane. In those days, if you got on the shuttle, they sold you your ticket on the shuttle. Remember that thing with the little card?
$16.
You got it, the little card, the guy came. So I said, Al, I'm in the clothes I've been in for 24 hours. He said, oh, get on the plane. So I'm on the plane with Al, and we're going down to Washington, and it's the big march. Remember that? That was the Eastern Shuttle.
Right,
That's
right.
exactly what it was. Good work. So we get down to, and I still had a piece of an apartment in Washington that I hadn't seen in weeks and weeks. I said, oh, no, you got to go to the memorial. So we go to the Washington Memorial, and suddenly I'm standing in the back of the memorial with Al, with Hosea Williams and the people announcing that the Poor People's Campaign is going to start that week and everything. And I have to tell you, for a kid from Northeast Philadelphia, I was living a big life, a really big life.
Well, you were trying to do something really big, too.
Well, I was trying to do something good with my life. I'd been a reporter. That didn't work. That didn't change the world. So I kept trying to figure what could I do to make things better. So that then, of course, Al, who is a dreamer, he announces a thing that we're going to do in Chicago called the Coalition for an Open Convention. I don't know why Democrats always come up with these terms. The coalition, it could be like win this year, better term. So we're supposed to bring together McCarthy and Kennedy delegates. And I called Dick. I said, would you come to this? He said, not for $1 million. He said, it's going to be madness. He said, Chicago, he was the first person to say to me that Chicago was going to be a bloodbath because he knew so well how things worked. Am I right, Doris? He really
Right,
did.
absolutely.
He really knew this. So we get together and we have these 3 days of people talking at each other in Chicago. And it was extraordinary. I went back to Long Island.
You left. You didn't stay for the convention.
I didn't stay. No, I didn't stay. I went to the convention weeks and weeks before, organizing stuff, trying to have the liberal alternative to the craziness in the street. But I told Al the week before the convention, I said, this is really too hard. I can't do this. So instead, I flew to Cape Cod, where I'd never been before, and a woman named Nancy McDonald, Dwight McDonald's ex-wife, had a house, and I knew her son. And I watched it on TV, the convention on TV. It did feel very far away, very far away. But the first morning when I woke up, I was still on whatever time I was on, and I went outside to the dock that was on Slough Pond, kind of fancy, expensive shacks, right? And there's this small man in the next house, and he's going to dive into the pond, and he doesn't have bathing suit. But there's nobody up but me. And years later, as we were graciously being hosted for lunch at Kay Graham's house, I was seated beside Arthur Schlesinger.
That's who it was.
And she told him the story.
Of course. And he was proud.
No,
So-
I did.
Why don't you talk about the convention? Because
Oh, yeah.
you had a very different perspective on what was happening then.
Well, first, Dick did go to the convention.
Yeah.
I mean, he ran the peace plank, actually.
Yes.
That was the hope, that if they could get a peace plank in the
Right.
platform, it would show the strength of the anti-war movement and have to affect Lyndon Johnson and public sentiment. I just went as a vacation. I was working in the White House, but I had a week off, and I went with a bunch of my anti-war friends to the convention. And so we're all staying in the same suite. We had no special access to anything. We were really watching it on television, but we were there. We were in the day we'd wander out and come back. And it was getting bad, and I was beginning to feel, oh my God, how can I be working for Lyndon Johnson? And maybe if he calls me to ask me to do something official for him, which was unlikely, I'm going to take my stand, I tell all my friends. So we're sitting in the room, and the phone rings, and somebody says, it's the president for you. And I thought he was kidding, and it turns out it was. So I get on the phone, and he said, Doris, I have a favor to ask you. I thought, oh my God, here it comes, I'm gonna do it. And he said, last week when you were at the ranch, you borrowed my flashlight and I can't find it. It was so embarrassing because I was gonna make my stand. So then anyway, but then I said to him, well, how are you? And he said, I'm terrible. How do you imagine I am? He said, I can't even come to the convention. He was gonna come, it was gonna be his birthday. They had a huge birthday cake. And they told him, you cannot come, it will be bedlam. This is my party. I feel as low as I've ever felt. And then I felt bad. And then so I was going backwards and forwards between empathy for him and feeling about the war. But then Dick, when we talked about it, he said he was absolutely certain he saw me there. We had this thing where all the time he would tell me, I was looking for you my whole life. He said he saw me at the Civil Rights March along with 250,000 other people. He said he saw me at, after the riots with Martin Luther King's death, we had to get passes to go to work at night. And he said he was sure my car was being checked with his car. Then he saw me in Grant Park that night at the convention. I wish I'd met him all that time, but I hadn't. But he was very important at that convention. He not only shepherded as much when they got a good showing on the peace playing, but then he went back to the hotel, the Hilton Hotel, where all the McCarthy kids were staying, to say goodbye to them, because some of them had come, even though many of them didn't and shouldn't. McCarthy didn't want them to come. He was afraid of the violence, which they had. And just as he got back to the hotel, the police were coming in against the McCarthy kids. They thought something had been thrown out in front of them. And he rounded, and they were hurt. Some kids were hospitalized, and he was right there in the middle of it. Then they carted them down as if they were going to go to jail, and he had a suit on. So the only reason they didn't go against him was because he had a suit on. He told all the kids to sit down, and he then pretended. He said, "I'm calling McCarthy now. I'm calling Hubert Humphrey." He couldn't reach either of them, but the police thought they had, so they went away. But he felt that sense of connection back to those kids again that he'd felt during the campaign. So he and you, and then we became great friends, so this is really terrific.
Yeah, and I have to say something about that, because you and Dick both played a critical role in my life. I was very young when I was George McGovern's speechwriter in 1972. We did lose 49 states, but I have to say none of us went to jail. Doris was instrumental in making me a Kennedy Fellow at Harvard a year after that campaign. And then 6 years later, Dick played a decisive role in Ted Kennedy deciding to hire me for his 1980 campaign. Doris knows the story, and I certainly
you tell it.
I certainly remember it. There were people who objected, who were around Senator Kennedy, and they said, look, he worked for Carter and quit. And said, I have to, in fairness, say, by the way, I think he was an exemplary ex-president, but I didn't think he was going to be a very good president. And I had quit. And so Dick is saying, but we're running against Carter, so what difference does it make? And at the critical moment, Steve Smith, Ted Kennedy's brother-in-law, who I later became very good friends with, was really upset about this. He said, what if he does this to us? What if he comes in and then he writes something and, you know, and turns on us? And Dick said, takes out a checkbook and writes a check for $10,000 and tears it in half and gives half to Steve and keeps the other half himself and says, if that happens, you can have my half of the check and you can have the $10,000. The long and the short of it was I got hired, and Doris, what's the punchline?
That he had $500 in his checking account. But
it was not the first time.
It was not the first time. The first time he did that was in McCarthy campaign. They were down to the last 48 hours, and they needed to have radio points on every hour, every day, and they were told it was going to cost something like $20,000. And he's with the Gold Dust Twins, Arnie Hyatt and Howard Stein, and they're saying, we just can't do it. We've run out of money. So he takes out this proverbial checkbook again. He says, who should I make it out to, the ad people or the campaign? And then Arnie Hyatt and Barra says, we'll pay for it. but he wrote a great ad for him that night. It was about leadership. He said to all the New Hampshire people, just think what it'd be like if you wake up tomorrow morning and you know that New Hampshire has changed the course of the country. So, I mean, it's just what's so great about being with both of you tonight. It's just the older you get, the more these old friends matter and these old memories matter. So to be able to talk about all this, and I know Dick would be very happy. He was so proud of Mary Lou. He was so proud of what you became with Ted Kennedy. You were the most important person in his life. And to be part of keeping you there, although he may have gotten there anyway, would have made him very happy.
Well, I have to say, I mean, Teddy Kennedy became one of my best friends, and Dick played, I believe, an absolutely essential role in that. And I was speechwriter and then press secretary, and then I went off to start a consulting firm, and Kennedy called me and said, do you have any clients yet? I said, no. He said, yes, you do. He said, I'm sending over a retainer because you need a bridge before you start to get clients. And then he was my client, but far more than that to me, for the next 29 years, last 29 years of his life. You know, the 1960s we lived through were suffused with such high hopes and such deep pain. As each of you look back from a distance more than half a century ago. What do you remember most? And do we have anything to learn from that period that can help America navigate another tumultuous time? Oatsie?
So I'm going to tell a very personal story about Doris. I went up with my then husband to see Dick. What was that town in Maine?
Kingfield.
Kingfield, Maine, where he was living there. And we were going to stay for several days, and we even brought our dog, Sancho Palmer, you know. And we get there, and I'm rummaging around in this guest room, and I open a drawer. There's nothing in the chest of drawers except a photo. And the photo is one of those kinds that you would get at the drugstore. You got like a whole thing of them, had like little edges around it. And there's Dick, and on his lap is this small woman, young woman, with a quilted bathrobe on. I think of those as dorm bathrobes, right? With the zipper. And she's laughing. But, and this makes me cry, but I'm not going to cry. Dick is so happy. I had never seen Dick Goodwin so happy as he was with the blonde on his lap.
Okay, now. Give the last word to the blonde.
I never heard that story. This is so great. I love it. You
it.
saved that. I'd like to think of myself as a blonde with a robe on, making him happy. That would make me very happy.
Really happy.
No, I think, I think what's so important for young people, that's why history matters so much today. It's so heartbreaking to me that we're teaching less history in high school. We're teaching less history in college. There aren't as many professors around. Because at a time like this, history helps us. It makes us know the 60s, as you said, it had terrible things that happened, but great things happened too. It's like I sometimes think at the end of a marriage that doesn't work, if only you could remember the good things and not simply the bad things that made it end. We don't want to just remember what made the 60s end, all those deaths and those riots and the anti-war violence. It was a time when people felt alive because they were doing something larger than themselves. Whatever that feeling is, the civil rights movement had it, the women's movement had it, the gay rights movement had it. This is all in the 60s. And we have to get that feeling back if we're going to get our country back right now. We have to get our young people to not feel it's so hard right now to know where we can do and what we can act in. But we have, the government is us. It's not some foreign group out there. It's who we are. And we are citizens. People say, what are the guardrails against what's happening now? It's us, the citizens. It always has been. When Lincoln was said, you were a liberator after the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, I was not. It was the anti-slavery movement. It was the soldiers that did it all. When Teddy Roosevelt is lionized for having changed the Industrial Revolution's laws and regulations, it was the progressive movement. Already the Settlement House, Jane Addams, they're out there in the cities. The social gospel is in religion. It's always the union movement. You know the union movement. You said you know the union movement. That was so important for Roosevelt. And then, of course, the civil rights movement did everything for the 60s, I think. I think it set the tone. So we've just got to believe in ourselves. We should do it in our cities. We've got to do it in our states. We've got to do it in our school boards. And we've got to believe again what people felt in the 60s. It's the most important legacy that's left, not the deaths, but rather the lives that people led when they felt authentically alive.
Thank you both for living history with us.
Yeah,
thanks.
it was great.
All of you.
Wow.